It was on one of those January mornings when London feels reluctant to rise, a pale, reluctant sun barely piercing the mist curling over Baker Street, when I, Dr. John H. Watson, found my friend Sherlock Holmes seated by the fireplace, his lean fingers steepled beneath his chin and his sharp grey eyes fixed on the sealed envelope resting on the Persian rug before him. Holmes had not spoken a word since I entered, nor had he acknowledged the breakfast tray Mrs. Hudson had dutifully laid on the small table near the settee. The tea had gone cold, toast had curled at the corners. Only the envelope, cream-coloured and marked by a curious insignia pressed into the red wax seal, appeared to hold his attention. I sat opposite him and ventured mildly, "Another case, Holmes." He tilted his head slowly toward me, his lips parting in what might have been a wry smile, but it was far too subtle to confirm. Instead, he picked up the envelope with his fingertips and held it out to me. "Tell me, Watson, what do you make of this?" I took it, noting the heavy quality of the paper and the peculiar seal, an embossed image of a blooming rose enclosed within a crescent moon. The parchment bore no return address. There was no scent upon it, no personal mark, save the seal. Intrigued, I broke it open and read aloud. "Mr. Sherlock Holmes, at 1 minute past midnight, a single rose bloomed in the conservatory of Grimsdyke House, though it has not been watered in over a year, and the plant was thought dead. At the same hour, a young woman vanished from her locked chamber. Her name was Eleanor Tewkesbury. The household believes it to be a tragic accident. I do not. Come at once. Discretion is vital. S." The letter was unsigned, save that solitary initial. I looked up. Well, this is either a poetic hoax, or someone has a flair for the theatrical. Holmes stood, already moving toward the coat stand. "Not a hoax, Watson, a warning, or perhaps a riddle. And the riddle is far too elegant to ignore." As the cab rattled its way through the frozen cobbles of Westminster, Holmes remained pensive, only breaking silence to murmur, "You recall Lady Theodosia Grimsdyke, do you not?" I searched my memory. "The eccentric widow who refused to have any of her clocks wound after her husband's death?" "Precisely. Her family seat is Grimsdyke House in Surrey. The rose referenced in the letter, if it is the one I suspect, was a wedding gift to her from the Grand Duke Constantine of Russia, a unique cultivar. It only bloomed once on the night of her wedding. Since then, it has been as lifeless as a dried thorn. Until last night." "You believe this could have something to do with her granddaughter's disappearance?" Holmes shrugged lightly. "I believe the sender of that letter believes so. That alone merits a visit." Grimsdyke House stood like a slumbering giant at the edge of a frost-rimmed moor, its ivy-covered walls bathed in an eerie, pale light. A manservant led us through the tiled halls, past ancestral portraits with solemn eyes, until we were shown into a small, octagonal room, the conservatory. It was quiet, chillingly so. There, in the centre of a collection of withered shrubs and faded blooms, stood a single rose bush, barren save for one crimson bloom, its petals shockingly fresh against the cold glass and dead soil. Holmes knelt beside it and ran a gloved hand gently along the stem. "No footprints," he murmured. "No condensation inside the glass. And yet this bloom is no illusion." A soft voice interrupted us. "You came. I wasn't sure you would." We turned to see a woman in her 60s, thin as bone china, her silver hair pinned back in a style that belonged to a different century. She wore a deep violet gown embroidered with stars. Her eyes, like faded ink, regarded Holmes with cautious hope. "I am Sybil Grimsdyke. I sent the letter." Holmes inclined his head. Then I presume you do not believe Miss Eleanor left of her own accord? She couldn't have. Sybil's voice wavered, but her spine remained erect. Her door was locked from the inside. The only window opened a mere 6 inches. There were no sounds, no struggle. And when I went to wake her for church this morning, the room was empty. Holmes turned to me. Watson, if you'd examine the chamber, Sybil, I should like to see the key used to open that locked door and the household list, every name, every servant, every guest. As Sybil left the room, Holmes continued to inspect the rows. Watson, does it not strike you as peculiar? I returned from my brief examination. The soil is dry, there are cobwebs on the nearby pots, and yet this rose is unmistakably fresh. It's not been placed here recently. There's no evidence of disturbance. Just so, Holmes said softly. This house is holding its breath. The question is why. Back in the main hall, we were met by a young man in riding attire, dark curls, a strong jaw, and wary eyes that flicked toward Holmes with veiled suspicion. Michael Tewkesbury, he introduced himself curtly, Eleanor's brother. I presume you've spoken to the constabulary? I asked. Of course, he said. But they say there's no sign of forced entry and no evidence she left the room. They think she had a breakdown, that she ran away, but Eleanor would never do that. She loved this place. Holmes eyed him carefully. And you? Michael narrowed his eyes. What do you mean? Holmes turned away without answering. That evening, as darkness fell, Holmes and I stood once more in Eleanor's chamber. The lock had indeed been secured from the inside. The window remained only partly ajar. No marks, no footprints, no sign of escape. On the writing desk, Holmes picked up a hairbrush. Then he reached for the journal resting beneath it. He flipped the pages silently before stopping at one, just as I leaned over to glance at it. In delicate handwriting were 6 curious words written at the top of the final page. Midnight rose. Bloom, follow, mirror, door, silence. Holmes looked up. Watson, we are being challenged, and someone, somewhere in this house is watching to see if we're clever enough to understand the rules. He closed the journal softly and his voice dropped. Tonight, we wait, because whoever opened that flower may return to bury the thorn. Holmes insisted we remain at Grimsdyke House that evening. Lady Sybil, after some protestations about impropriety, agreed to let us use the west guest room, an old nursery converted hastily into quarters for visiting clergy during Lent. Holmes claimed it would afford us a view of both the conservatory and the southern corridor leading to Eleanor's locked chamber. As twilight surrendered to the hush of midnight, the house seemed to shift into something older than stone and wood, some hushed breathing thing pressing its secrets into the very walls. No light shone from the servants' wing. The household had retired, as requested, but Holmes remained awake, unmoving at the window like a gargoyle of deduction. I sat in the corner chair, blanket over my knees, notebook in hand. She wrote mirror and door in her final entry, I said quietly. What do you suppose she meant? Holmes didn't turn from the glass. Children are taught to fear mirrors. Adults forget why. And the door? Which door? That is the question. The one she vanished through, or the one she wanted someone else to find? I frowned. You believe Eleanor may have left voluntarily? I believe someone made it appear she did not. At precisely 2 minutes past midnight, Holmes rose suddenly and gestured for silence. A soft sound, like a sigh drawn in reverse, reached us from the hallway. A faint creak of a floorboard, the brush of cloth against wallpaper. Holmes moved swiftly and silently, opening our door a mere inch. A dark figure cloaked and gliding, passed down the corridor toward the conservatory. They carried something long in one hand. I made to follow, but Holmes held up a finger, then pointed silently toward Eleanor's room. A moment later, the cloaked figure doubled back. They paused in front of the locked chamber, did nothing, and continued down the stairs. Holmes waited precisely 1 minute before pulling the door open and stepping into the corridor. I followed, heart pounding. We descended the grand staircase into the drawing room, where the fire had burned down to orange embers. The cloaked figure stood near the hearth, removing their hood. It was Sybil. She looked up without surprise. "I knew you would follow. I was counting on it." Holmes stepped forward, his tone even. "Lady Sybil, your movements at this hour invite suspicion." Her mouth twisted. "Then let them. I have lived in this house long enough to learn its rhythms. Tonight, something is wrong with the air. That rose should not have bloomed. Eleanor should not be gone. I walk these halls not because I am guilty, but because I am afraid." Holmes regarded her silently for a moment. "What was in your hand?" I asked. She turned the object toward us, a slender pruning blade, antique, silver-handled. "It belonged to my husband," she said. "I found it placed by the door of my dressing room. I carry it for comfort, nothing more." Holmes's gaze flicked to the fireplace mantel. "And the painting that once hung above the hearth?" Sybil turned. Her face lost what little colour remained. "It was there this morning." Indeed, the large frame of the family portrait, the Grimsdyke lineage, as I recalled from a hallway copy, was now missing. Only dust outlines and nail holes remained. Holmes stepped forward and examined the mantel. "Odd," he said softly. "No debris, no scratches. Someone removed it with great care, and yet without alerting the household." He turned to Sybil. "Is there any significance to that painting, beyond genealogy?" She hesitated. "It depicted all of us. Myself, my late husband, my daughter Alicia, her husband William Tewkesbury, and the children, Michael and Eleanor. But—" She frowned. "It was painted after William's death, as a posthumous inclusion. The artist worked from a miniature." Where was Eleanor positioned? "Far right, next to the window painted behind her. The rose window, we called it, though there was never such a thing in this house. It was an artistic indulgence." Holmes nodded once. "Then the painting is not merely stolen, it is a message." Back in the corridor, Holmes paused outside Eleanor's chamber. He removed a small tin case from his coat, containing slender tools of his trade. A flick of the wrist, a twist, and the lock clicked open. We entered quietly. The room had not changed since our afternoon inspection. The half-drawn curtains, the neatly folded dressing gown, the book of verses beside the pillow. Holmes made no move toward the bed or the desk. Instead, he crossed to the tall standing mirror in the corner. It was old, gilt-framed, and spotted with age, but tall enough to reflect the room in full. Holmes touched the surface with his gloved palm, then leaned in and sniffed. "Lavender oil." I blinked. "But there's no bottle." "No, but the scent is fresh. Someone touched this mirror recently, rubbed oil along the frame. See here, finger smudges." I leaned closer. Indeed, there were faint, greasy imprints, too deliberate to be casual. Holmes reached into his coat and pulled out a small vial. With a dropper, he collected residue from the edge of the glass. "For analysis later," he murmured. Suddenly he straightened and tapped the corner of the mirror frame. "Hinges." "What?" "It's not just a mirror," he said, pushing gently. The frame groaned, just slightly, and began to swing inward on disguised hinges. Behind it was a narrow recess, a shallow cavity in the wall. At its base, a scrap of fabric and a broken wax seal. Holmes picked up the fabric. It was part of a sash, pale blue silk, torn unevenly. "Eleanor's," he said. "This confirms it. She was here after she was supposedly missing." "And the seal?" I asked. Holmes held up the fragment. The image of the crescent moon and blooming rose was unmistakable. "She was trying to communicate," Holmes said, "but not with the household, not with her family." He turned toward me, the firelight from the hall flickering across his expression. She was communicating with someone who already understood the code. We heard footsteps in the hall, heavy, purposeful. Lestrade entered, his moustache bristling, trailed by a constable and the young man, Michael Tewkesbury. "You might have waited, Holmes," the inspector said, brusquely. "I came as soon as I received the wire." Holmes turned without surprise. "Then we're only just in time, Inspector." "For what?" "To catch the person who knew where Eleanor was hidden, before she vanished the second time." Michael paled. "You mean she's still in the house?" Holmes didn't answer. He looked back toward the open mirror panel, and for the first time I saw something flicker across his features, not triumph nor confidence, but urgency. The moon hung low over Grimsdyke House, its silver gaze diffused by the mist rolling off the moorland. Inside the manor, Lestrade's arrival had stirred the household from its silence. Boots echoed on marble floors, and anxious whispers carried from room to room. Holmes, however, remained a still figure in the doorway of Eleanor's chamber, one gloved hand resting on the edge of the secret compartment hidden behind the mirror. Lestrade, ever practical, strode to the hidden recess and peered inside. "Well, I'll be—" "Clever concealment, I'll grant you, but a bit theatrical even for a disappearance." Holmes turned to him, eyes sharp. "This was no escape, Lestrade. It was a message, and messages require an audience." The inspector grunted. That assumed she put it there herself. For all we know, someone else planted the fabric and seal to lead us in circles. Holmes gestured to the interior wall of the recess. "What do you see?" Lestrade blinked, then crouched and squinted. "Looks like—" "Fine scratches?" "Not scratches," Holmes corrected. "Impressions left by fingernails, 4 in a downward arc, recent enough to retain particulate matter. Watson, your lens." I handed Holmes my pocket magnifier. He examined the markings in silence, then produced a slender camel hair brush from his kit. With gentle precision, he gathered the faint dust and deposited it into a folded paper. "Charcoal dust mixed with chalk and linen fibre," he murmured, "suggestive of an artist's studio." Lestrade frowned. "And what does that tell us?" Holmes looked up. "That the girl was likely dragged from this hiding place by someone who'd spent time near an easel earlier that day. Perhaps someone involved with the missing painting." Michael, who had lingered near the doorway, stiffened. "Are you accusing our portraitist?" Holmes didn't blink. "No, Mr. Tewkesbury. I am observing that an artist was involved, directly or indirectly, that's all." Michael glanced away. "That portrait was completed nearly a year ago. The artist, Mr. Lawrence Hearn, was dismissed shortly after. He and my aunt had a disagreement." "On what grounds?" Holmes asked, already moving toward the hallway. Michael hesitated. "He painted my father's eyes wrong." Lestrade blinked. "That's hardly a crime." "It is," Michael said coldly. "When the portrait was intended as a memorial, my father had brown eyes. Hearn painted them grey. My grandmother took it as an insult. Said he'd sullied the memory of her son-in-law." Holmes nodded slowly. A personal quarrel masked as artistic critique. Curious. We descended once more to the drawing-room. Morning light had begun to smear the frost-lined windows, turning the furniture into silhouettes of pale gold. Holmes gestured to the empty space above the hearth where the family portrait had once hung. "I'd like to see the copy in the corridor," he said. Lady Sybil, summoned by a servant, met us near the grand staircase. She looked wearier than before, her gown now a plain wool dressing robe, her face pinched by sleeplessness. "The house is beginning to fray," she said quietly. "Too many footsteps, too many suspicions." Holmes gave a slight nod, but said nothing as he examined the hallway reproduction. It was indeed a copy, cruder than the original, perhaps done by another hand. Eleanor stood to the far right, her expression almost melancholic. Behind her, the famed rose window glowed with imagined sunlight. Holmes studied it for several minutes, then stepped closer and ran a finger along the wooden frame. "Do you mind if I remove it?" he asked. Sybil hesitated, then nodded. Holmes carefully lifted the painting from the wall and examined its back. Almost immediately something fluttered from behind the canvas, a folded piece of heavy parchment. Watson retrieved it. It's sealed with the same rose and crescent emblem. Holmes took it from me and broke the wax. Inside was a sketch, a pencil drawing of the rose in the conservatory. But this one was different. There were symbols drawn into the folds of the petals, faint and almost imperceptible. Below it, written in a fine hand, "To see what's buried, do not look down. The rose is never alone, it always points to the silent twin." Lestrade grumbled. "Poetry again." But Holmes stood stock still. "Not poetry, instruction." We returned to the conservatory. The rose still stood proud, a surreal crimson beacon in the dry, lifeless soil. Holmes crouched beside the flower pot, hands moving methodically. "Watson, the compass from your kit, please." I handed it to him. He placed it on the ground beside the rose, watching the needle carefully. "North aligns true, but the rose's orientation. Yes, the stem bends east, subtly, toward the elderberry hedge. Interesting." He rose and walked to the base of the glass wall, tapping gently along the tiles. A hollow sound emerged at the far edge, near the joint where the conservatory met the servants' passage. "Watson, Lestrade, help me lift this tile." We pried the square free, revealing a shallow cavity. Inside lay a velvet pouch and, shockingly, a small leather-bound book. Holmes opened the pouch first. Inside was a key, ornate, old, with rose motifs etched into its bow. Then he turned to the book. As he flipped it open, a sheet of tracing paper fluttered free. It bore a penciled copy of the symbols from the rose sketch, each annotated in Latin. "Someone was decoding a cipher," Holmes whispered. Lestrade leaned over his shoulder. "Where do you suppose this key fits?" Holmes looked up, his gaze distant. "I don't know, not yet, but the rose has pointed us to a secret buried in memory, and someone is desperate to keep it hidden." He closed the book carefully. "And Eleanor Tewkesbury may have found it first." That afternoon, Holmes requested to see Eleanor's school records. Lady Sybil had them locked away in a cabinet in her study. As she opened the drawer, a slip of paper caught Holmes's eye, lodged between the folders. He drew it out. It was a telegram, sent 2 weeks ago to Lady Sybil Grimsdyke from E.T. London have found something important. Tell no one. Returning Wednesday, the rose knows. Holmes read it aloud, and the room fell still. Sybil pressed a hand to her chest. "I never saw that telegram, I swear it." Holmes turned the paper over. On the back was scribbled a single line in unfamiliar handwriting. "She's begun to remember. It cannot continue." As we left the study, Holmes turned to me with the tightest flicker of concern I'd ever seen in his eyes. "We're not chasing a simple disappearance, Watson." "No." No, we are untangling a memory someone tried to erase and the person who failed to forget. The weather turned sharply that morning, the sky sagging with low grey clouds that hung like an unspoken threat. Grimsdyke House seemed to shrink beneath it, its gables hunched, its stone growing damp and dark. The mystery thickened like the fog rising off the moors, and within the house each face we passed seemed a little more strained, each glance a little more carefully measured. Holmes moved quickly after we discovered the cipher book and key beneath the rose, as though the find had sparked a fire in him. He refused breakfast, waved off questions from Lestrade, and requested that the household staff be kept occupied elsewhere. "I want no eyes on us," he said flatly. "Only the walls may watch, and I intend to watch them back." We returned to the portrait gallery, long, narrow, and flanked by stern faces in oils. The missing Grimsdyke family portrait remained a blank space above the hearth in the drawing-room, but Holmes's attention had shifted to the second copy, the corridor version with Eleanor and her fictional rose window. "You'll recall," he said, eyes fixed on the canvas, "Lady Sybil told us the original had Eleanor positioned beside an imagined rose window." "Yes," I nodded. "A flourish by the artist? A symbolic choice, perhaps?" "Symbolism is rarely arbitrary, Watson, and in this house it is never safe." Holmes lifted the painting once more, gently prizing away the canvas backing. No fresh notes fell this time, only dust and the faint smell of linseed oil. But as he tilted the painting under the hall sconce, his eye caught on a faint bulge in the painted plaster behind the image. "Watson, bring me the palette knife." From his case I produced a small brass instrument, and with slow, delicate movements, Holmes scraped away at a corner of the oil paint in the background. It took several careful strokes before the faint edge of something beneath revealed itself. Another painting, or rather, an overpainting. Holmes peeled back a fragment of the upper layer to reveal a different background beneath the fictional rose window. This one showed bookshelves. "Remarkable," Holmes murmured. "The window never existed, and perhaps neither did Eleanor's placement in this room." Lestrade, who had just joined us again, frowned. "Are you saying the portrait was altered after the fact?" Holmes stepped back, hands clasped behind him. "No, I'm saying this is not a copy. This is the original portrait, retouched, repainted, and hung in plain sight, mislabeled as a duplicate." Lady Sybil, summoned once again, stared at the newly exposed background with horror. "I swear to you," she whispered, "that is not how it was delivered to me. I remember the window. I remember it clearly. I chose the frame myself with the floral inlays to match it." "Then either the artist lied or someone lied to him," Holmes said. He nodded to me. "Watson, let's review the artist's dismissal. We must speak with Lawrence Hearn." Hearn's studio, according to the house records, was once housed in the gardener's lodge, an outbuilding now unused. Michael retrieved the rusted key from a drawer in the estate office and accompanied us down the frost-licked path, past hedges grown wild from neglect. The studio was locked, dust coating the windows like a shroud. Inside, the air was musty and dense. Easels still stood by the walls as if the artist had only just stepped out for tea, though the dust suggested years of abandonment. A wooden crate in the corner bore Hearn's initials, half faded in paint. Holmes circled the room silently, fingers gliding, over surfaces without touching them. At last, he crouched beside a storage cupboard near the hearth. "The latch has been forced," he said quietly. He opened the door to reveal several rolled canvases, studies, mostly of brushwork, and incomplete portraits. But at the back, carefully preserved in parchment, was something more intriguing, a small charcoal study, dated 2 years prior. We unrolled it on the old work table. It was Eleanor. Younger, perhaps 17, but what caught our attention was the object behind her, a tall bookcase with a single conspicuous gap near its centre. In that gap, a rose carved in wood. "The same background as beneath the overpainting," I said. Holmes nodded slowly. "It proves that Eleanor was not originally placed beside a fictional window, but in a real location. The artist sketched her in front of a very particular room, and someone, afterward, painted it out." "Why?" asked Michael, who stood a little apart, eyes narrowed. "To hide the room's significance," Holmes replied. "Or perhaps to hide what she knew of it." Later that afternoon, we gained access to the library, a room of dust and echoes, its high-arched ceiling giving it the acoustics of a chapel. Holmes moved with deliberate purpose, scanning each bookcase, comparing them silently to the sketch in Hearn's study. I watched as his eyes darted from grain pattern to shelving gaps, pausing finally before a corner unit beneath a tall portrait of Lord Grimsdyke in his parliamentary robes. He tapped the middle shelf. It didn't ring hollow, but the carving on the side rail, a rose almost worn to smoothness, matched the sketch exactly. "Watson," he said, "help me shift this shelf." It took considerable effort. The entire bookcase moved, groaning on a pivot we hadn't known existed. Behind it lay a cavity barely large enough to admit a person crawling on hands and knees. Inside it was dark, smelling of mildew and stone, but there was no mistaking what lay on the dusty floor. A tattered scarf, blue silk, and a footprint in ash. Holmes examined the scarf, brushing it open to reveal a monogram embroidered at the edge. E.T. Lestrade knelt beside the footprint. "Someone's been here, recently?" Holmes nodded. "Yes. And if I'm not mistaken, they crawled out rather than in. The ash trails outward." He turned to me. "This room was a hiding place, perhaps even a sanctuary, but not a prison." Outside, a low wind began to howl across the moors, rattling the window panes. Holmes replaced the scarf carefully into his coat and turned back to the hidden chamber. "We are being led, Watson, not by Eleanor alone, but by the person who helped her once, the one who understood her notes. The cipher, the sketches, the symbols." He paused. "And the one person who has not yet spoken a word about her since we arrived." "Who?" I asked. Holmes met my eyes. "The maid, the one assigned to Eleanor, the one who has quite conveniently vanished into the background." The wind had grown meaner by dusk. It screamed through the chimneys like something being chased, and Grimsdyke House seemed to shudder beneath it. Within the stone walls, however, a quieter kind of storm brewed. Holmes stood in the study, holding the folded household ledger Lady Sybil had retrieved at his request. The list, painstakingly written in faded ink, detailed the names of all staff, permanent and temporary, over the past 18 months. It was a document of order and bureaucracy, and yet one name was conspicuously absent. "Miss Eleanor's maid," Holmes said, tapping the margin with a finger. "She is nowhere to be found." Lestrade squinted at the ledger. "Could have been an oversight, or perhaps she wasn't officially employed. Temporary help, maybe." Holmes shook his head. "In this house, nothing is temporary, not even the wallpaper." I sat across from him, turning over my recollections. "But there was a young woman. I saw her briefly on our first evening. She passed through the upstairs corridor as we were shown to our room. Brown hair, low cap, and she avoided our gaze." Holmes nodded. "I saw her too, once, near the conservatory. She was emptying a vase of water. She looked up only long enough to vanish again." "Then what shall we do?" asked Lestrade. Holmes smiled faintly. We shall inquire about someone who isn't supposed to exist." After dinner, Holmes gathered the entire household, excluding Lady Sybil, who claimed fatigue, in the music room. Servants stood awkwardly in 2 rows, maids, footmen, the cook, the groundskeeper, and the butler, Mr. Finch. Holmes stepped forward, hands clasped behind him. "I wish to express my appreciation for your cooperation during our investigation," he began, in a tone that masked the trap he was setting. "Before we conclude tonight, I must ask each of you a simple question, one at a time." The staff exchanged wary glances. He began with the butler. "Mr. Finch, do you recall the name of the maid assigned to Miss Eleanor these past 2 weeks?" The butler blinked. "That would be Alice Turnby, sir." Holmes raised an eyebrow. "You are certain?" "Yes, sir. Alice was with the household nearly 6 months, came on Lady Sybil's personal recommendation. Quiet girl, kept to herself." Holmes turned to the housekeeper. "Mrs. Blanchard." "And you?" The housekeeper pursed her lips. "I, Alice. I'll admit I found her odd. She often read aloud to Miss Eleanor, poetry, mostly. Byron and Blake." "Did she have friends among the staff?" Mrs. Blanchard shook her head. "Not that I ever saw. Ate alone, spoke little, but Eleanor seemed fond of her." Holmes nodded thoughtfully. He asked the same question of each remaining staff member. Most answered with some variation of Alice Turnby. A few claimed they rarely saw her at all. Finally, he addressed the room. "Very good. Now, one final thing. I would like someone to retrieve Miss Turnby. I wish to speak with her personally." A silence followed. Then a footman stepped forward, brow furrowed. "Sir, Miss Turnby isn't here. She left the morning after Miss Eleanor vanished. Said she had family in Sussex." Holmes turned sharply. "She left? On whose authority?" The footman paled. She said Lady Sybil permitted it. I assumed—" Holmes turned to Lestrade. "Have a message sent to the Sussex Constabulary. Ask for confirmation. There is no Alice Turnby registered as a resident there, I assure you." Lestrade grunted and left the room at once. Holmes turned to the housekeeper. "Was her room cleared?" "No, sir," said Mrs. Blanchard. "I was told not to enter until you'd had a look." Holmes's eyes flicked toward me. "Watson, shall we?" Alice Turnby's room lay at the far end of the 3rd floor, an attic conversion with a sloped ceiling and a single dormer window overlooking the back gardens. The door creaked as we entered, and a musty chill greeted us. The bed was unmade. A trunk sat at the foot, locked. The wardrobe hung open, its contents missing, save for a single house uniform on a hook. Holmes scanned the room, then knelt beside the small writing desk near the window. He opened the drawer and drew out a slim notebook, half filled with tidy, almost calligraphic handwriting. I leaned over to read the title on the first page, Reflections and Fragments for E.T. A poem followed. When words were buried, she carved in glass, a mirror's edge, a question asked. The rose that blooms beneath the night knows silence better than the light. Holmes turned the pages slowly, examining the margins. Some pages had small sketches, leaves, keys, petals. One showed a girl standing in front of a mirror, her hand pressed flat against the glass. On the opposite page, a line of text scrawled hastily. "If I am not found, look where the dust doesn't settle." He looked up. "Watson, the floor." I dropped to my knees. The room was thick with dust, except for a narrow rectangle behind the dresser. Holmes and I moved it carefully aside, revealing a loose floorboard. Beneath it was a small pouch. Inside, a locket. Within the locket, a photograph of Eleanor and another girl cheek to cheek, laughing. "Alice?" I asked. Holmes nodded. "Not her real name, I think, but yes. Look, same cheekbone, same brow." He opened the pouch further. Another slip of paper. On it, a hastily scrawled note. She remembers the library. She remembers the rose window. I fear they'll move her before she speaks. I tried to hide the book, but I think he's already guessed. I'll return when it's safe. Burn this after reading. SP. SP? I asked. Holmes stood, slowly folding the note. There was once a Miss Sarah Pinter in Lady Sybil's employ, he said. Dismissed 3 years ago after a disagreement about her unsuitable closeness with the young mistress. And you believe she returned under a false name? To protect Eleanor, or to learn the truth? He pocketed the letter. She was our hidden witness, and now she's vanished too. Later that evening, Lestrade returned from the village telegraph office. You were right, Holmes. No record of Alice Turnby in Sussex, and no relatives filed under the name either. It's a ghost. Holmes nodded grimly. Not a ghost, Inspector, a guardian. But what was she guarding? Holmes's expression darkened. Not just a girl, Lestrade, a memory, one someone in this house worked very hard to erase. He turned toward the corridor. And if I'm correct, that memory is buried not in Eleanor's absence, but in her silence. That night, the fire in the drawing-room flickered like a nervous witness. The storm outside had gathered with more force, slashing at the windows in erratic bursts. Within Grimsdyke House, Holmes's silence became its own weather system, still, dense, and unsettling. He stood by the hearth, holding the photograph we had found in the attic, the one of Eleanor and Sarah Pinter. His eyes moved across their features with mechanical precision, as if indexing each detail against some internal catalogue. Watson and I sat opposite, waiting. I believe, Holmes said at last, we are circling the wrong event. I leaned forward. What do you mean? He turned the photo over, blank. We have treated Eleanor's disappearance as the primary disturbance, he said. But what if it is only the echo? An echo of what? He looked up. Of something that happened years ago, something this house tried to bury. I believe Eleanor was not investigating her present danger, but rediscovering someone else's. By morning, Lady Sybil had retreated fully into her suite. The staff murmured about her frailty, her nerves, her migraines. But Holmes suspected something deeper. He requested we speak with her again, and after considerable resistance, she agreed to see us. The sitting room was dim, heavy drapes blocked the daylight, and a coal fire hissed low in the grate. Lady Sybil sat in a high-backed chair, wrapped in a shawl. Her hands, I noted, trembled not with age, but with something closer to dread. Holmes bowed slightly. "Forgive the intrusion, Lady Sybil. We need your help untangling one final thread." "I have told you everything I know," she said, without warmth. "And yet Eleanor and her maid both vanished beneath your roof," Holmes replied. "And the family portrait, the ciphered notebook, the telegram, each of them speaks not of madness but of a message." She closed her eyes briefly, then opened them. "What is it you want to know?" Holmes leaned forward. "Who was Sarah Pinter? And why was she dismissed?" Sybil's expression flickered. For a moment she seemed almost relieved to have been asked directly. "She was a quiet girl, intelligent, too intelligent. She took to Eleanor in a way that unnerved me." "How so?" "She believed in nonsense, secret symbols, poetry as prophecy. Eleanor adored her for it, of course. They would stay up late talking about shadows and flowers and riddles. I thought it harmless until I found Sarah teaching Eleanor how to cipher letters." "Cipher?" "Substitution codes, hidden meanings in books, mirror writing. I told her it was unsuitable. She defied me. I dismissed her." "Did Eleanor know the real reason?" I told her Sarah left for another position. She cried for a week, refused to eat, but children forget, or so I believed. Holmes said nothing. The silence lengthened. Sybil suddenly added, "There was a box." Holmes's brow lifted. "A box? A cedar chest. Eleanor kept it as a child. She called it her Museum of Quiet Things. After Sarah left, she locked it and never opened it again." Holmes turned to me. "Watson?" "The nursery." The nursery, long disused, had been turned into a storage room for old furniture and out-of-season decor. Dust floated in lazy drifts through the morning light. Against the far wall, beneath a draped armoire, sat a small cedar box with brass corners and a tarnished lock. Holmes examined it without touching. "Note the faint scratch along the keyhole. Someone tried to force it recently and failed." He withdrew the ornate, rose-etched key we had found beneath the conservatory tile. It slid in perfectly. The lid opened with a sigh. Inside were objects of childhood and memory. Feathers, ribbons, a broken locket, a crumpled theatre programme. But beneath these, carefully wrapped in faded blue cloth, lay a small, leather-bound volume. Holmes opened it. On the first page, in a hand unmistakably Eleanor's, "This is not my memory. It is the one I was given. I no longer know which is mine." He turned the pages slowly. Each one contained entries written over months, perhaps years. "Sarah says truth hides in repetition, that to remember you must first forget. Grandmother says I never had a sister, but the mirror says otherwise. The man with the paint on his boots said the rose window wasn't his idea." Watson inhaled sharply. "A sister?" Holmes turned to the middle of the book. A pressed rose fell from the crease. Underneath, "There were two of us, always two. The dream always ends the same way. One of us behind the glass." Holmes's face was unreadable. She may not have meant a literal sister, but it's clear she was grappling with a split in memory, something buried or altered. He closed the book. "We must speak with Lawrence Hearn." Hearn's London address, found in the estate's old correspondence files, led us to a weather-stained boarding house near Clerkenwell. The artist greeted us with suspicion, but allowed us in when Holmes mentioned Eleanor's name. He was older now, gaunt, his hands stained with fresh charcoal. The art studio reeked of turpentine and regret. "I told them the portrait was wrong," Hearn said. "I painted what I saw, and they said I was mad." "What did you see?" Holmes asked. Hearn tapped a canvas behind him, an unfinished painting of a girl with two faces blurred into one. There were two, not twins, not exactly, one sharper, one softer, one more in the light. Holmes frowned. "You mean Eleanor and her maid?" Hearn shook his head. "No, this was years before that girl arrived. Back when Eleanor was barely 10, she would speak to someone no one else could see. Said they were unfinished. That the rose window let her see the parts she'd misplaced." I stepped closer. "You think she was dissociating?" "I think she was remembering." Holmes straightened. "And the background? The rose window?" Hearn looked haunted. "I painted bookshelves. They asked for a window. I painted a lie to earn my coin. But she wept when she saw it. Said I'd taken the only real thing away." Back at Grimsdyke, dusk had fallen. Holmes stood once more in the conservatory, gazing at the rose that bloomed against all logic. "This isn't a case of disappearance," he said quietly. "No?" I asked. "No, this is a case of disassembly, of a girl who was taken apart, memory by memory, and who tried to build herself again from shadows, symbols, and silence." He turned toward me, eyes alight with a fire I had seen only in the most perilous moments. "And someone in this house knew how to break her in the first place. Night had reclaimed Grimsdyke House, and this time it came not quietly, but with a persistent whisper, like something unseen brushing past closed doors. Holmes, ever attuned to such disturbances, stood once again in the library, hands clasped behind his back, the soft tap of his foot against the floor the only sound in the room. We had returned not out of habit, but because Holmes insisted the final key to the mystery still lay hidden beneath our feet, or behind a wall, somewhere within the library's forgotten architecture. The cedar box, the cipher book, the poems, the attic note from Sarah Pinter, each had pointed us back to this room. This house, Holmes murmured, eyes half-lidded, was built in 1839, additions in 1874, the conservatory in 1901, but the library, this room, is original. He moved to the carved rose emblem beside the bookcase we had previously discovered to conceal a hidden passage. He touched it lightly, then let his hand drift down the seam of the adjacent panel. "Do you hear it, Watson?" I paused, listening. A faint hollow beneath the far corner rug. Holmes pulled it back. Beneath the ornate carpet was a single, pale oak plank, lighter than its neighbours. He knelt and ran his fingers along the edge, locating the narrow split. With a small knife from his coat, he pried it up gently. A square section of the floor lifted. Beneath was a cavity, and within it a second box. This one was iron, its surface rusted, its edges riveted. Holmes exhaled sharply, the only sign of tension I'd seen from him in hours. He lifted it out. No lock, he noted, merely a clasp. He opened it slowly. Inside, wrapped in oilskin and time, was a bundle of papers tied with twine. On top, a document bearing a faded seal. I leaned in. "It's a birth certificate," I whispered. "Two names." Holmes read aloud. Eleanor Sybil Tewkesbury, Charlotte, Grace Tewkesbury Lestrade, who had just entered the room behind us, said nothing for a long moment. "Twins," he muttered. There were two. Holmes nodded gravely. And one of them was erased. The revelation chilled the room more than the winter air. Holmes laid the certificate flat on the library table, then gently opened the next item in the box, a leather-bound daybook with ink entries in a firm, looping hand. Lady Alicia Tewkesbury's, Eleanor's mother. Holmes flipped through the entries, stopping at one dated March 3rd, 1897. "Charlotte had another fit today. I fear her nerves will never settle. Eleanor tries to soothe her, but they are not like other children. They see too much, hear too much. The doctor says it may be best to keep Charlotte away from mirrors." Another entry, dated April 10th, 1897. "Sybil insists only Eleanor will be presented at the summer garden party. Says one strong child is preferable to two strange ones." I disagree, but I am tired of fighting. Charlotte seems to vanish when not spoken to. Holmes's voice was quiet. "Vanishing not in body, Watson, but in presence. Sybil decided one child would be easier to raise. Eleanor was chosen. Charlotte was dismissed." We turned the pages. The entries grew sparse after 1898. The final one, dated June 12th, 1899. "Charlotte stood at the conservatory window last night, staring into nothing. She whispered, 'I will not be forgotten.' Sybil says it's a phase, but I wonder if you can erase someone by pretending hard enough." There were no entries after that. Holmes closed the book, slowly. "Charlotte was institutionalized," he said. "Or worse." Lestrade scowled. "But where's the record? Why isn't she mentioned in the family ledger?" "Because," Holmes replied, "someone removed her from more than just the house. They removed her from memory." The following morning, Holmes requested a private conversation with Lady Sybil. She resisted, but eventually agreed to meet us once more in her sitting room. She looked frail but composed, her lips pursed in a line carved by years of control. Holmes did not begin with accusation. He simply placed the birth certificate and diary on her lap. She did not touch them. "Why now?" she asked softly. "Because Eleanor remembered," Holmes replied. Piece by piece, through symbols, poetry, and hidden corners, and she was not alone. Sybil's hands trembled. "She was always the quieter one," she whispered. "Charlotte, I mean, but it wasn't silence, really. It was intensity. You looked into her eyes and saw too much, like a mirror with no frame." "Where is she now?" I asked gently. Lady Sybil did not answer. Holmes pressed. "If she is alive, she must be found. If not, the truth must still be known." At last, Sybil stood and walked to a side cabinet. From within she retrieved a heavy envelope. She handed it to Holmes without looking him in the eye. "It was never supposed to be opened," she said. Only if Eleanor asked the right question." Holmes opened the envelope. Inside, a letter from a private sanatorium in Sussex, admittance form for Charlotte Grace Tewkesbury, dated August 7th, 1899. Diagnosis: catatonic dissociation, nonverbal, persistent fixation on mirrored selves. Sybil spoke again. "We told everyone it was a grief reaction, that Alicia had lost a child. She agreed, eventually, said it was better than scandal. We paid for Charlotte's care, but no one was allowed to visit, not even Eleanor." "Why?" I asked, stunned. "Because if she saw her," Sybil said slowly, "she would remember. And once she remembered, she would ask the question we couldn't answer." Lestrade folded his arms. "And now she's gone, both of them." "No," Holmes corrected. "They came back together, in fragments. Sarah Pinter helped Eleanor connect the pieces. The rose was their symbol, the cipher, the journal, the painting, all clues. But someone in this house knew what was being uncovered." He looked Sybil directly in the eyes. "Who else knew?" A pause. Then Sybil said with a tremor, "Michael." The name rang through the room like a cold bell. Holmes rose instantly. "The brother," he said. Too perfect in his grief, too controlled in his silences. "He told us he believed Eleanor would never leave." Lestrade swore under his breath. "We need to find him, now!" But Holmes was already at the door. "Watson, come with me. We're running out of time." Holmes and I crossed the front courtyard of Grimsdyke House at a pace just shy of a run. The wind had calmed since the previous evening, but a heavy stillness now blanketed the moor, as if the land itself had paused in anticipation. The sky had darkened prematurely, bringing with it the hush of a coming storm. Holmes's eyes were fixed ahead, jaw taut, his gloved hands clenched behind his back as he moved. "Michael," he said as we passed beneath the barren rose trellis arching the side path, "has never lied outright, but deception rarely requires untruth, only the careful withholding of it." I kept stride beside him. "You believe he knew about Charlotte all along?" Holmes gave a curt nod. "He lived in this house. He saw the portraits change. He watched his sister grow troubled and secretive. He would have noticed the names scrubbed from ledgers, the poems tucked into drawers. And he knew who Sarah Pinter was. Of that I am now certain. He did not speak her name once in our presence, not out of ignorance, but design." We reached the far edge of the estate gardens, where the hedges grew taller and unkempt. Beyond them lay the old stonemason's cottage, long disused, its windows shuttered, ivy creeping through the mortar like green veins. Holmes slowed. "Now there," he said, pointing. A faint thread of smoke curled from the cottage chimney. Inside, the air was close and damp. The fireplace was lit, barely. A kettle sat cold on the hearth, never boiled. On a low table near the window lay several objects: a fountain pen, an open journal, a pair of leather gloves, and a key. Holmes picked up the journal. Its pages were mostly blank, save one entry in Michael's hand. I did not ask to carry their silence. I only wanted Eleanor to forget. I thought if she stopped digging, the echoes would stop. But they grew louder. She said the rose was a mirror, that it reflected the part of her we buried. She asked me finally about Charlotte. I told her the truth, but too late. Holmes closed the book and turned slowly. "Watson, he's fled." "To where?" Holmes picked up the key. "This is not for the house, nor the gardener's lodge. It belongs to something older." He held it up. The bow was etched with a faint crosshatch, a pattern I recognized from the rose motif on the cedar box, but more angular. Holmes snapped his fingers. "The chapel." The Grimsdyke family chapel stood at the rear edge of the estate, half consumed by overgrowth. Ivy smothered the stone facade, and the iron gate groaned in protest as we pushed it open. The interior was cold and damp, filled with the scent of crumbling hymnals and extinguished incense. At the far end, the altar had been stripped bare. Pews sagged under the weight of time. Holmes moved directly to the right wall to a wooden hatch near the ground, a crypt access, long bolted shut. The key turned, the hatch opened, and the cold breath of the earth met us. We descended slowly. The steps were narrow and slick, carved into the ground itself. A single lantern had been left lit at the base of the crypt, casting long shadows across the vault's walls. Stone shelves lined the chamber, many empty. But one corner had been cleared. There sat Michael Tewkesbury. On the floor beside him lay Eleanor, unconscious, wrapped in a wool blanket, her breathing shallow but steady. Holmes did not move forward. Instead, he spoke softly. "She's alive." Michael nodded without looking up. "Yes." Watson moved forward, crouching at Eleanor's side. "She's dehydrated, weak, but she's not harmed." Michael stared into the dark. Michael Tewkesbury sat in the flickering half-light of the crypt like a man who had come to the end of a story he had never intended to begin. Eleanor lay curled beside him on the stone floor, wrapped in her blanket, her breath thin but rhythmic. Watson knelt over her, examining her pulse with gentle fingers and a doctor's instinctive worry. The lantern on the floor sent slow-turning shadows up the curved stone walls as though the dead were watching. "She came willingly," Michael repeated, not looking at either of us. "After I told her, after I said the name." Holmes did not interrupt. He stood still, hands folded behind him, the picture of patience, but I had known him too long not to detect the tight coil of readiness behind that stillness. He watched Michael like a predator does a wounded stag, not with cruelty, but with exacting attention. "I'd kept it from her for so long," Michael went on. "I thought it would die if I stopped saying it. That's what they all believed, that a name, unspoken, could be forgotten." "And you?" Holmes asked. "I was a boy when Charlotte was taken. I remember her only in fragments. 2 girls in the nursery, always dancing in and out of each other's shadows. One would laugh, the other would follow. They were halves of the same music." He looked up at last. "Until one morning, only one half remained." Watson glanced up from Eleanor. "She'll need rest, food, water, but she'll recover." Holmes nodded but didn't move. "Why bring her here, Michael?" "Because this is the only place the house didn't change." His voice trembled. Everywhere else, walls were rebuilt, doors sealed, records burned. But this was left untouched. I knew the crypt had to be part of it. Holmes moved closer. "And was it?" Michael gestured to the far wall. "Look behind the iron plaque, left of the family altar." Holmes approached cautiously. The plaque in question bore the name Elizabeth Grimsdyke, 1802, 1848, but it was mounted awkwardly as though it had been added in haste. He reached beneath it and pried gently at the corner. The plaque swung open like a cabinet door. Behind it, a stone recess. Inside, a sealed jar clouded with age, and beneath it, folded papers, some crumbling with damp, others still legible. Holmes retrieved the papers and brought them to the lantern. They were letters, diaries, all addressed to or referencing Charlotte. One in Alicia Tewkesbury's hand. She dreams in reverse, this child. She calls herself by other names. She says, "The rose in the glass told her I am not her mother," and when she looks into the mirror, she does not see herself. She sees her sister watching back. Another letter, unsigned. "If we are to protect Eleanor, Charlotte must be erased from all but the private record. The family cannot weather another scandal. Let her illness be unnamed. Let her place in the line be hidden. Let only the rose know." Holmes looked at Michael. "You are hiding more than your sister. You are hiding the mechanism by which she was vanished." Michael nodded once. "I didn't know it was still here, but I suspected. Eleanor began asking about the rose again last month. Said the plant had bloomed in her dream, and that someone was standing beside it. A girl with her eyes." "And Sarah Pinter?" "She returned under a new name, found Eleanor's journal, helped her remember. I didn't stop her. I thought it might help Eleanor find peace. But when she started drawing the ciphered petals again, when she remembered the mirror, I grew afraid. I thought she might go looking for Charlotte. I couldn't risk it." Holmes's expression darkened. "So you led her here?" Michael exhaled. "I wanted to show her where the forgetting began." Watson had helped Eleanor to sit up now. Her eyes fluttered open, murky with confusion, but focused enough to land on her brother. "Michael," she whispered, "is she here?" He swallowed hard. "She was once." "Did I know her?" Eleanor asked. "Yes," Holmes said gently, kneeling beside her now. "You knew her in the same way the moon knows the tide. She shaped you, though no one spoke her name." Eleanor looked down, fingers trembling as they clutched the blanket. "I remember standing by the rose window, but there was no window, only the reflection." Holmes nodded. "Charlotte was placed in a sanatorium under a false name. Your family constructed a world in which she had never existed. But the mind cannot erase what the heart continues to echo. You felt her absence like a missing note in a melody. That's why you wrote your poems. That's why the rose bloomed again." "Because she was remembered?" Eleanor whispered. Holmes smiled faintly. "Because you never stopped searching for her?" She closed her eyes. Tears escaped down her cheeks. "I was never just one person," she said. "There were always two." By the time we returned to the house with Eleanor, weak but conscious, Lady Sybil was waiting at the door. Her face was pale, her eyes hollow. "She knows," Holmes said quietly as we passed her. Sybil reached out to touch Eleanor's hand, but the girl pulled it away. Without a word, Eleanor turned and followed Watson up the stairs. Holmes remained with Sybil in the foyer. "She will want to visit Charlotte," he said. Sybil nodded faintly. "It's not permitted. The institution—" Holmes raised a finger. "You will make it permitted. You will write the letter yourself." She closed her eyes. "I only ever wanted to protect her." "From what?" Holmes asked, voice low. "The truth?" Sybil said nothing. That night, back in the library, Holmes opened the last of the recovered letters. This one bore a small pressed rose, sealed inside with wax. It was a note from Charlotte. "If one day I am found, do not ask for proof. The mirror is not a witness, the rose is not a clock, but she will know me by the sound we used to make, the one that was ours alone. He folded the letter and handed it to Watson for safekeeping. Outside, the storm had lifted. The house creaked in the absence of wind, as if uncertain how to stand in such stillness. Holmes turned to me. "We are not finished," he said. "No, there is one question left unanswered." I raised an eyebrow. "Which?" He looked out the window toward the chapel beyond the garden. If Charlotte was erased from the family, who brought the rose back to life? The morning after Eleanor's return, Grimsdyke House felt transformed, not quite lighter, but less weighted by omission. The staff moved quietly, but not in fear, and even the creaking of the stairs and the distant tapping of branches against the windows carried the peculiar note of expectancy, as though the very walls were listening for what would come next. Holmes had risen early and refused breakfast, instead pacing the perimeter of the conservatory in a long wool coat, his gaze flitting constantly from the now fading bloom of the midnight rose to the patterns of soil and ash beneath it. I found him there just past 7, a flask of hot coffee in my hand and a question on my lips. "She's sleeping?" he asked, before I'd even spoken. "Yes," I said. Watson gave her something mild. She was speaking in fragments before falling asleep, about the scent of lavender, the sound of wings in a locked room, the phrase "silent twin" repeated over and over. Holmes made no reply. Instead, he bent down and scraped a small portion of the soil near the rose's roots with his penknife. Beneath the top layer of earth was something curious, a fine powder, light grey and fibrous, not unlike the charcoal dust we'd found behind the mirror. "Someone returned here recently," Holmes said, "but not for the rose, for what lay beneath it." He pointed to the faint curve of a shoe print in the far corner of the conservatory, partly obscured by fallen leaves. It was too small for Michael, and it faced away from the rose toward the garden path. "Someone who knew where to look," I said. "Yes," Holmes murmured, standing. "And who knew how not to be seen." By mid-morning, Lady Sybil had retreated into seclusion again. Holmes requested that no one disturb her. Lestrade, still uneasy from the prior night's revelations, spent his time questioning the staff yet again. Though he admitted none of them had seen anyone leave the estate or enter the chapel after Michael's confession. "Perhaps the girl returned on her own," Lestrade said. "Eleanor said she saw her in a dream. Maybe it was just that, a dream, brought on by Sarah Pinter's stories." But Holmes remained silent. He returned to the cedar box that afternoon. The letters inside, we now understood, were Charlotte's only remaining voice, entries preserved in secrecy, hidden where only Eleanor's memory might find them. One final page remained at the bottom. Holmes unfolded it slowly. They dressed me in grey, said it was calming, but I saw only fog. I am not a wound that must be closed. I am a door that was locked. One day, when the rose returns, so shall I, but only if someone remembers the shape of my voice. Beneath the words was a name scrawled faintly and in reverse, as though written against a pane of glass. Char Holmes's voice, when he spoke, was as low as I'd ever heard it. "She's been here," he said, "recently, and she left something behind." We returned once again to the family chapel just before dusk. The air was sharp with frost, and the bare branches above us curled like fingers frozen mid-prayer. Holmes carried the lantern this time, but it remained unlit. The moon was rising behind the chapel's rose-shaped stained glass, casting its soft silhouette over the path. At the chapel door, he paused. "Charlotte never truly left," he said. We entered. The interior was unchanged, dusty, cold, still. Holmes moved not to the crypt, but to the pews. He knelt beside the second one on the left, and reached beneath the seat. I heard the snap of a hidden latch. A small compartment opened. Inside, a folded note written in violet ink. The rose returned because the door was opened, but not by Eleanor, by me. She still thinks we are different people. She hasn't yet realized we are the same melody in two keys. I come when she sleeps, when no one sees. She dreams of mirrors, but I remember the frame. C. Holmes exhaled slowly. Charlotte was never far, Watson. She's been coming back, fragment by fragment. First in Eleanor's mind, then in person. I believe she escaped the sanatorium long ago. The records were altered, or perhaps never sent at all. Lady Sybil's desire to erase her became so complete, no one ever checked if the erasure succeeded. And now, she's returned, and I suspect she's been living within the estate for days, perhaps weeks. The small footprints in the conservatory, the pressed petals in the cipher book, the lavender oil on the mirror, each a fingerprint. We stood in silence. And yet, I said, slowly, if she's still here, why not come forward? Holmes looked toward the rose window above the altar. The moon had moved into its center, casting fractured light through the red and green glass. She's waiting, he said. For what? For her reflection to speak back. That evening, Eleanor awoke with clarity for the first time since her disappearance. She sat up in bed, her voice faint but lucid. She came, she said to Watson and me. She knelt beside me in the crypt. I thought it was another dream. But her hand was warm. Holmes entered the room quietly. You were never dreaming, he said. You were remembering. Charlotte was never a ghost. She was a mirror the family turned to the wall. Eleanor nodded slowly. I used to hear her humming when I fell asleep, she said. But they told me it was wind. I used to see her reflection, but they said it was mine. Tears welled in her eyes. They made me believe I was whole. Holmes stepped forward. You are, but only now that you know you were divided. At midnight, a final note was found. It had been placed on the conservatory windowsill, held down by a stone. There was no signature. Only one sentence. Tell them I don't need to be remembered anymore. I remember myself now. Holmes read it once, then placed it in Eleanor's hands. She was waiting, he said softly, for your voice, and now she's heard it. 2 days later, under a grey and glassy sky, Holmes requested the drawing room be prepared for one final gathering. The storm had not returned, but the air retained the charge of something unspoken. The great house was quieter than ever, not in dread now, but in recognition. As though it, too, understood the long silence was coming to an end. Lady Sybil arrived first, veiled in black, though it was not a funeral. Her hands shook as she adjusted her gloves, but she said nothing. Lestrade followed, arms folded and jaw clenched, not out of frustration, but because he suspected, quite rightly, that the tale was about to tilt into territory where the law could not reach. Eleanor came last, walking slowly beside me, a wool shawl around her shoulders and her gaze fixed forward. Holmes stood by the hearth, his eyes glinting with that peculiar flame he only allowed to surface when he was ready to stitch the threads into a final pattern. No one spoke, until Holmes did. There are stories we choose to forget, he began, and others we are made to forget. And the greatest danger lies in mistaking the two. He stepped away from the fire. Eleanor Tewkesbury was made to forget her sister, not by violence, but by omission, by suggestion, by the careful removal of objects, records, names. Her mind tried to reconcile this void. It invented mirrors, symbols, and dreams. But the human mind, especially one as sensitive as Eleanor's, does not erase. It encodes. Lady Sybil stiffened. I did what was necessary to protect the family's standing. Holmes turned. No, Lady Sybil. You did what was necessary to protect a fiction, and the cost was the splitting of a single soul across two lives. He walked to the centre of the room and produced the final letter, the one left at the conservatory, unsigned. This note, he said, was not written by Eleanor, nor by Sarah Pinter. It was written by Charlotte Grace Tewkesbury. She has returned, not as a ghost, not as a threat, but as someone who has remembered herself. Sybil closed her eyes. She was unwell. She couldn't separate truth from illusion. That's what the doctors said. No, Holmes replied, voice quiet but firm. That's what you required them to say, because Charlotte was a mirror too clear to tolerate. She saw you, she saw the family's cracks, she heard the unsaid, and refused to be silenced. Holmes handed the letter to Eleanor, who read it slowly and pressed it to her chest. She's near, she whispered. Even now. Lestrade cleared his throat. So what now? There's no crime I can prosecute, no body, no disappearance that lasted more than a few days. No, Holmes said, but there is an act of restitution. That evening, at Holmes's request, we returned to the chapel for the last time. The sun had sunk low, casting fractured light through the stained glass rose at its apex. Eleanor walked ahead of us, alone, a lantern in her hand. Holmes, Lestrade, and I followed a respectful distance behind. She paused before the altar, where Holmes had uncovered Charlotte's final note. Then, slowly, she lifted the lantern and turned a full circle, casting its glow on each shadowed corner. Nothing. Silence. But then, from the far pew, movement. A figure stepped out, no longer hiding. She was slender, wrapped in a long grey coat. Her hair was darker than Eleanor's, but the shape of her brow, the tilt of her head, and the unmistakable expression of quiet strength revealed everything. Charlotte. She stepped forward. Eleanor didn't flinch. She set the lantern on the floor and moved slowly, deliberately, into her sister's arms. No tears. Just the silence of recognition. Later, as the sisters spoke in hushed voices beneath the rose window, Holmes and I stood at the chapel door. She never left the estate then, I said. No, Holmes replied. She remained in the margins, the disused corners, the gaps between floors and behind walls. Every large estate has them, unused linen closets, hollow stair risers, decoy rooms. She moved like a wraith because that was how she had survived. And the rose, Holmes allowed a smile. A gardener's daughter once told me something remarkable, that some roses only bloom in stress conditions, rare cultivars triggered by shifts in humidity or vibration, but I believe Charlotte cared for that flower long before anyone noticed it. She brought it back. She did, as a symbol, as an invitation. She waited until Eleanor was ready. I was quiet a moment. So what happens now? Holmes watched the sisters in the soft flicker of candlelight. Now, he said, they will begin again, not as fragments, but as one. By morning, Charlotte was gone again, not in fear, but in choice. Eleanor found a note on her pillow, folded carefully between pages of her cipher book. Let them keep the ledgers, let them keep the portraits. We have each other's names again. That is enough. See, Holmes said nothing when I showed it to him. He simply placed it in the cedar box, now closed for good, and locked it with the rose-etched key. As we prepared to leave Grimsdyke House, Holmes stood once more in the conservatory. The rose had begun to fade, petals curling inward, colour softening to rust. Yet it remained, proof that something once thought dead had bloomed in silence. You've solved many strange cases, I said, but never one quite like this. He looked out over the frosted gardens, the wind stirring the vines. "This wasn't a crime," he said. "It was a correction." I nodded. "And Charlotte? She's not missing any more, Watson?" He turned away from the window. "She's remembered,"